Today's story was very public and caused a lot of sensation. Let's look at all the circumstances of the case. Human cruelty sometimes exceeds all imaginable limits. The victim of our story today died a painful death in a fire. But the saddest part is that this all happened because of a loved one who betrayed her. Kimberly Antonicus was born in 1974 in New York, USA, and was the only child of the family. Her father, Thomas, was a tall, successful businessman. He initially dealt with real estate, but later, after their daughter was born, he began working with computers. This field was very promising. The family had more than enough money, and the loving father readily used it to fulfill his child's every wish. After some time, the parents divorced, and the child was left with her mother. During this time, she was only 1 year old. The girl had contact with her father only on weekends. Thomas cherished these short moments when he could take his daughter and spend free time with her. A few years later, the girl's mother decided to move to Florida, where she found a new man and wanted to start a family with him. At this time, the mother gave the girl the option to choose with whom she wanted to stay. Kimberly decided not to leave New York, where she had grown up, and so the daughter began to live with her father, with whom she got along very well. The daughter even jokingly asked her father not to remarry so that their relationship would not change negatively. When Kimberly was 20 years old, she was studying at college. She was considered an intelligent and lovable young beauty who was a lot of fun, open, sociable, and even a bit naive. Her parents surrounded her with care throughout her childhood, literally not letting her struggle with difficulties and solving everything for her. The dark sides of the world and people, all possible problems, passed by the young beauty, and thanks to this, she had an open heart. In 1994, Kimberly wanted to move into her own apartment and live alone. She asked her father, who was initially against it because he was very worried about his daughter's safety. But at the same time, he understood that she had to become independent and build her own life. The daughter was already 20 years old. He still cared for her and was very afraid for her, but he did not want to upset his daughter, so he agreed anyway. Later, they went into the city to look for suitable accommodation. For safety reasons, the man chose an apartment for her that was in a safe neighborhood of the city, and almost immediately after her move, he also bought her a garage space across the street so she could park her car. To stay in touch with her, her father gave her a mobile phone. It should be noted that we are talking about events that took place in the mid-1990s, before the advent of modern mobile phones and the active development of messaging apps. Back then, mobile phones looked different and didn't have the functions they have today. But the most important thing was that they offered the possibility to stay in touch with loved ones at any time. Computers were also not yet so widespread that it was not easy and was very expensive to get a mobile phone. This shows how much Thomas cared about his daughter's safety and how much effort he made. He even bought Kimberly a pit bull puppy because he assumed that his daughter would feel more comfortable with it, that the dog would grow up and protect her. The father had reason to worry, as he had protected his daughter for years and had more than once experienced how she chose unfortunate friends who hurt her. The man wanted to make sure she was safe, not knowing what hard trial life had in store for her. Thomas worried about Kimberly and repeatedly told his daughter that he wanted her to come back and live with him. He also offered her a job in the family business, but she refused because she wanted to find her own way in life. The father never pressured his daughter and wanted to give her free choice. Kimberly lived a typical college life during this time, with parties and entertainment and the desire to be free without parental supervision. She had recently taken a part-time job as an accountant in an office, but the people she trusted turned out to be real traitors. Unfortunately, she did not suspect what cruel end awaited her. On February 28, 1995, Kim went to another party. Usually, she went to such events with her friend Liz Pace. Here, the young women danced and had fun. The next day, March 1st, Kimberly was supposed to go to work, but her colleagues noticed her absence. They began to worry, and eventually, Kimberly's manager called her father. The employee began to speculate that Kimberly was simply sick and couldn't report to the office. But instead of confirming that his daughter was at home, Thomas panicked. Moreover, he hadn't heard from her since the evening of February 28th. The man tried to reach his daughter, but she didn't respond. He contacted all the friends of his daughter that he knew, but no one had seen her since she left the party early in the morning of March 1st. The alarmed father decided not to wait and immediately turned to the police. But unfortunately, he also received the usual response. The police officers noted that it was a young woman who had disappeared after a party. She was an adult and could do as she pleased. Legally, she could have stayed overnight at a friend's place and returned later. At least 24 hours would have to pass before she could be considered missing. This answer, of course, did not satisfy Thomas. So he organized his own search party, which included his daughter's friends. They first went to the parking lot near Kimberly's apartment. Here, it looked like she hadn't returned from the party. Her car, a '94 Honda Accord that her father had given her, was not in her parking spot. She was also not in the apartment. With this information, the man went back to the police station and insisted that something had happened to his daughter. The police officers, however, were unyielding. He searched various places where Kimberly could be and spoke to many people, paying special attention to the police officers and trying to draw law enforcement's attention to what had happened, until he finally met an investigator who was interested in the mysterious disappearance of the businessman's daughter. Like Thomas, he immediately had the feeling that something was wrong in this case despite the protocol. He said that immediate action was necessary and decided to personally help the father of the missing woman. The first thing the investigator had to do was to rule out all possible versions of the events. To do this, it was necessary to discard the possibility that she had run away from home. The investigator analyzed the transactions on the woman's bank card. It turned out that the missing woman had not used the card since the evening before her disappearance. The investigator called all the friends of the missing woman, but no one had seen her after her disappearance and did not know where she was. The police officer then determined the woman's daily routine to find out what she had done the day before. Perhaps there were some clues here. Quickly, it turned out that Kimberly had, on the morning before her disappearance on February 28th, attended college classes as usual. After the end of the school day, the student went to her work. After working a few hours, she contacted her friend Liz Pace. The two always went to parties together. They went to a party where they celebrated and had a few drinks, and around 4 a.m., they decided it was time to part ways. They then drove together in Kimberly's car to Liz's house, which was literally just a few blocks from Kimberly's apartment. Liz went home, and the missing woman set off for her apartment. Her friend never saw her again, so it was known that Kimberly had driven her car, even in a drunken state. Nevertheless, it was important to understand what happened to Kimberly after she dropped off Liz and drove to her parking spot. For this purpose, the police officer went to the missing woman's house and searched the garage area. The investigator tried to find any traces or markings that could help reconstruct the events of the morning when Kimberly disappeared. The only thing the investigator could find was a gold earring. The father confirmed that it belonged to his daughter's jewelry when he showed it to him. Liz confirmed that Kimberly had worn these earrings at the party. There were no signs of a struggle or tire tracks from drivers accelerating or stopping. The car seemed to have been stolen very calmly. But the found earring unsettled the investigators, and the suspicion arose that this was how the burglar made his profit. At this point, other police officers were involved in the case, as there was every reason to believe that Kimberly had been kidnapped. To find the white Honda, the police officers began to search scrap yards and all places where the car could be dismantled for parts or sold. But everything was in vain. The vehicle seemed to have disappeared. To get more help with the investigation, Thomas turned to his lawyers and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In fact, apart from the white Honda, there were few clues. Thanks to her friend Liz, it was possible to determine what clothes the missing woman had worn. And from her words, a portrait was created to notify the city's citizens and gather information. The investigators also learned that she had 2 tattoos. One was an infinity sign with a naked couple in it. The second tattoo showed a scorpion, her zodiac sign. The police officers then decided to gain access to the woman's mobile phone. For this purpose, they went to the woman's apartment, where there was a landline phone from which 65 calls had been made on the morning of the disappearance. But not even that caught the officers' attention, but rather the fact that Kimberly's apartment was not empty. It even hosted guests, namely, a whole family. April, her boyfriend Joshua Torres, and their 2-year-old child lived there. The family admitted that during this time, the floor in their apartment was being renovated, and they didn't know where to stay during the renovation work. But Kimberly welcomed them by providing them with a guest room. As it turned out, they had already been living there for several weeks before the investigators arrived. The family was also worried about the disappearance of the apartment owner and said that they had not heard from her since the evening when Kimberly went to the party. This all seemed very strange. The father of the missing woman knew about the befriended family that his daughter had taken in and had always been against it, but Kimberly didn't want to listen to him. She was reliable and couldn't let her friend down. Of course, the couple was questioned first, and the investigators wanted to know why so many calls had been made on the morning of the disappearance of the landlord. Joshua claimed he had started calling all of Kimberly's friends and acquaintances when the woman didn't come home on time. According to him, the student was like a little sister to him, so he took care of her and was worried about her disappearance. Kimberly's mother was informed about the incident on the second day after her daughter's disappearance and flew in immediately from Florida. The woman stayed in Kimberly's apartment, and the cohabiting family was asked to move out. They continued to be treated as suspects. The mother of the missing woman participated in the search for her daughter, and a friend advised her to contact a clairvoyant who could say more about the probable fate of the woman. In her desperation, the woman took up this idea. When the woman visited the clairvoyant, she showed her photos of her daughter and asked for help. The clairvoyant said that Kimberly was still alive but in great danger. Therefore, the search should not be delayed. The missing woman was weak and dehydrated. Moreover, Kimberly had been kidnapped by people she knew. Kimberly had tried to escape captivity but had been caught and tied up again. The clairvoyant kept repeating that she had seen the letter J in one of the perpetrators' names. Apparently, the main culprit in the events, the kidnapper, was a young man whose name began with this letter. The mother of the missing woman passed this information on to the police. It was even the only information the investigators had at this point, and they decided to use this lead. The next day, it was broadcast everywhere in the New York news and caused a stir in society. And soon, there was a new turn in the case. On March 4th, around 2 a.m., a major fire broke out on 68th Street in Woodhaven, Queens. A witness to the incident later said that shortly before the fire, he had been walking his dog, which behaved very nervously near the house and barked at it for a long time, even though the property seemed quiet. It was an abandoned house, but it was very large, so the fire attracted attention and several fire units were needed to fight the fire. When the fire was finally extinguished, the police and firefighters began to search the ashes, as it seemed that really no one lived here. But in the basement, an unpleasant discovery awaited them. Below lay a burned corpse that was so badly burned that one could hardly recognize it as a woman with long dark hair. The worst part was that she was tied to a chair. The medical examiners confirmed that the dead woman's hands and feet were bound, that she wasn't wearing shoes, and that her hands were still tied behind her back even after her death. So it was clearly a murder. It was determined that she was still alive when the fire broke out. Her lungs seemed filled with smoke. This means that she was burned alive. During the investigation, it turned out that an intruder had poured a flammable liquid over the house and then set it on fire. Due to the poor condition of the body, it was difficult to identify the victim. They assumed that the burned person was the missing Kimberly. To identify the body, dental records were needed. To do this, the investigator contacted the father of the missing woman and expressed his suspicion. When examining the mortal remains, experts found tattoos that were identical to those described by Kimberly and a match with the dental records, confirming the investigators' fears. The police tried to take fingerprints in the garage where the victim's car was supposed to be parked and at the scene of the fire. However, the forensic scientists were unsuccessful. The traces were simply not present. They were thoroughly wiped away, or the kidnapper wore gloves. It was now clear why a neighbor had always stopped with his dog in recent days when the animal had become restless. Kimberly desperately wanted to free herself and call for help, so she made noises that the animal could hear but were not perceptible to the human ear. The police officers immediately contacted the owner of the burned-down house. He was shocked by what had happened. He had offered the house for sale a long time ago and had not been there himself anymore, but from time to time his employees came to check the condition of the house. He took a quick look at the doors and windows to make sure everything was in order and also picked up the mail. In those days when Kimberly was being held in the basement, he also appeared here as usual. He inspected the house from the outside, picked up the letters and the payment notices, and then simply left again. Since he was outside, he could not hear the woman because of the city noise, who was probably calling for help at that very moment. The man would have only had to go into the basement. Then he would have immediately noticed that something was wrong. Unfortunately, the man did not do that. Kimberly was a step away from being rescued, but that didn't help. Since all possible evidence was burned, the victim's family and the police were forced to turn to a clairvoyant again. This time, the woman said she could see 4 people who might be involved in the events, and she repeated again that the name of one of them began with the letter J. But the clairvoyant statement alone was not enough to find the murderer. The father of the victim offered a reward of $75,000 for information leading to the capture of the perpetrator. The police continued to investigate and found out that the father had returned to his house on the day of his daughter's disappearance and listened to the answering machine recordings. Here, there were 2 strange calls when there was silence on the other end of the line. They later played an important role in the case. In the meantime, the investigators speculated that it could have been Kimberly who tried to contact her father, or that the burglars might have called him to demand a ransom. But something prevented them. Perhaps there were communication problems. When the public learned what had happened, numerous rumors arose that even accused the father of the murdered woman, Thomas, of being responsible for his daughter's death. Some claimed he was a wealthy businessman with connections to the local mafia. The police checked this information and, despite the businessman's denial, could prove that he actually had no connections to crime. Kimberly's car was soon found. The vehicle had been parked for several days in one of the city's quiet streets, quite far from the scene of the fire. The residents did not know that the car was being searched for, as no one had officially reported it. But since the car had no owner, the investigators found the second gold earring of Kimberly when they arrived at the scene and examined the interior and trunk of the car. Hair and fingerprints were also found. After that, however, the investigation stalled for a long half-year. In September 1995, new witnesses came forward, a man and a woman who reported to the police. The couple claimed that their mutual friend had bragged about the massacre of Kimberly. They told about the 22-year-old Joshua Torres, the same young man whom Kimberly had taken in. The investigators then met with him again and decided to ask him some questions. He began to tell that on the morning of Kimberly's disappearance, he had called many of her friends. The only one who didn't answer the phone was a Russian guy. According to him, he was one of the ex-boyfriends of the woman. Joshua claimed that the missing woman was afraid of him. He also told the police that on the day Kimberly disappeared, he had seen a group of suspicious Russians driving through the neighborhood where they lived. After Thomas found out about this, he decided to continue his investigations. He drove to the address where the man lived to speak to him personally. But he was not there. Instead, the man managed to talk to the young man's neighbors. They all agreed that he was a rather unpleasant person who didn't communicate much with others. But no one could help find him. Only the next day did Thomas confront the man and was able to persuade him to make a statement at the police station. There, the investigators found a tattoo on his leg with the abbreviation Kim, which presumably originated during the relationship with the victim. However, the young man denied this and stated that the tattoo was dedicated to his close childhood friend. After a short interrogation, The investigators did not find anything unusual. The young man claimed to have nothing to do with Kimberly's murder and had a solid alibi that was confirmed. The investigators were convinced that he had nothing to do with the crime. The police officers analyzed the calls made from Kimberly's apartment when she disappeared. It turned out that Joshua had lied. He claimed he had called the pager of the young man. These were widespread in the USA at that time and were used instead of cell phones. It turned out that Joshua had sent several suspicious messages on that fateful morning while he was in the missing woman's apartment. The man claimed he just wanted to stay in touch with friends and made some evasive comments. Joshua's behavior became increasingly suspicious. By the way, his name began with the letter J, and this letter was repeatedly referred to by the clairvoyant who had been contacted by the mother of the deceased. After the investigators learned more about him, they found out that the young man had no job. He lived off his girlfriend's money and took care of the child while she worked. All this made him an ideal candidate for the role of a kidnapper. He could, in his free time, plan a crime, locate the victim, and bring her to the abandoned house to demand a ransom. But something went wrong, and the perpetrator was forced to destroy all evidence in a hurry, along with Kimberly. The investigators told Joshua that they did not consider Kim's former Russian boyfriend a suspect in this case. He was grilled, and the man talked. Joshua began to tell a new story. He suspected that his friends might be involved in the events. In this case, it was about 3 men who had kidnapped Kimberly in the parking lot and put her in the trunk. The first was Julio, an acquaintance. Friends confirmed that he had been together with Kimberly for some time and even wanted to marry her. However, she was not interested in such a relationship, and the couple separated. Under police pressure, he confessed to being an accomplice in the kidnapping. He said he didn't know they would kill her. The kidnappers just wanted a ransom because they needed the money and wanted to release the victim, but the plan didn't work out. The police were able to confirm the suspicion relatively quickly. April remembered that Joshua and his friends were watching TV on the day Kimberly was reported missing. When the news about the suspect, whose name began with the initial of his name, was broadcast, one of them stood up, hurried out, and called the others after him. It was the 19-year-old Nicholas Liberté, who had the nickname Jay. Later that day, the body of the missing woman was found in the basement of the burned-down house. Could it be that the kidnappers were frightened by the excitement and burned the woman to leave no traces? In this group was also the 20-year-old Jose Rodriguez, who was not related to Joshua, although he had the same surname. All the people involved in the case, who later became suspects, were friends of Joshua. All had dark sides in their past that were associated with criminal matters. However, these were minor offenses that paled in comparison to the brutality inflicted on Kimberly. It was found that Nicholas had been released on bail before the kidnapping. He was still under police surveillance. On the eve of Kimberly's murder, he broke into a friend's house and tried to rob his mother at gunpoint. Instead of a 5-year prison sentence for such an offense, he got away with a $1,000 fine, thanks to his mother, who hired a good lawyer for her son. Apparently, Nicholas was then seized by a sense of impunity and therefore decided to carry out a more lucrative plan: the kidnapping of a businessman's daughter. The police found that Joshua was the initiator of this crime. He was the one who decided that it was possible to kidnap a rich woman who was a friend's friend and demand ransom from her father. The man controlled Kimberly's movements and warned the accomplices when she was supposed to return from the party. It turned out that Joshua had a rather turbulent criminal past. He had kidnapped children since he was 17 years old, but was quickly caught and arrested. Due to his young age and the complexity of the case, however, he only received 5 years probation. Later, Joshua was arrested for sexual assault of a minor, but only served 60 days in jail. A year later, he was again imprisoned for 18 months, this time for illegal possession of a firearm. It turned out that he formed a gang with his friends, whose members were called Mixed Breed. Unfortunately, the leader of the gang, Joshua, disappeared after he had contacted the police. The police officers decided to talk to Joshua's roommate, April. As it turned out, He used his girlfriend as an alibi. The man coordinated the actions of the criminals who were in the house. In fact, the criminal abducted the friend behind the back of his beloved, but she didn't even suspect it. Thanks to the messages on the pager and the testimonies of the criminals, the police were able to understand their criminal plan in detail. It also became known that they had followed Kimberly to the party. There, they behaved quietly and inconspicuously and simply waited for her to go home and immediately followed her. The 4 kidnappers were identified, but by this time, one of the people involved in the massacre, Jose Rodriguez, was already dead. On June 23rd, 3 months after Kimberly's death, he was attacked on the street while walking with a baby in his arms. He was shot in the back of the head from behind. No one saw the moment of the attack, but there was reason to believe that this was Joshua's way of silencing his accomplice, as he knew that Jose regretted it and wanted to go to the police. The remaining 3 were arrested and charged with murder, arson, kidnapping, and holding a person against their will. Later, they were able to talk to each other and create a complete picture of the events. In the garage where they waited for Kim after the party, the perpetrators used a gun and duct tape. The woman resisted when they attacked her. She kicked and scratched the intruders, even broke her nails. However, her strength was not enough, and she was tied up with duct tape, with her mouth, eyes, and even ears taped shut. Then she was completely immobilized and thrown into the trunk. The perpetrators brought the victim to an abandoned house, lowered her into the basement, and tied her to a chair. They took off her shoes so she couldn't draw attention to herself. They told her that her father owed them money and then left Kimberly there for the next 3 days. The leader of the gang instructed Julio to go into the house and take care of the woman, give her something to eat and drink. However, since he was afraid of being caught by the police, he did not do so. As a result, the woman neither drank nor ate, was freezing, and begged for help. Immediately after she was brought to the abandoned house, the criminals informed Joshua that everything was ready. Then he made a tape recording in which he demanded $75,000 as ransom. Joshua called Kim's father and played this recording on the answering machine. However, he did not choose the right time, so the recording was silenced. As a precaution, Joshua called again, but again, the timing was wrong, so no one heard the ransom demand and didn't know that the criminals were waiting for the money. Kim could hardly breathe through her taped mouth. She repeatedly lost consciousness, but was still fighting for her life. In the meantime, the kidnappers hadn't heard anything from the victim's father. They hadn't even noticed that he hadn't received their messages. Instead of checking whether everything was going according to plan, they became angry. Since the burglars never received the ransom, they decided to let Kimberly go. They went into the basement, but found Kimberly lifeless. Later, medical examiners found out that this was not the case. She had only lost consciousness due to exhaustion, cold, and lack of food and drink. In the days when no one was watching over her or giving her anything to eat, she had become very cold and weak. They had previously wanted to burn down the house to erase their tracks, but now it was decided to do so along with the hostage to eliminate any evidence. The public called the crime the most brutal in the history of Queens, and there were calls for the death penalty, which, however, was banned in the state. The most controversial defendant in this case was Joshua. He was not directly involved in the massacre, although he coordinated the actions of the gang members. His girlfriend, April, testified against him in court. She said he had personally confessed to her what had happened. After he had run her over to silence her, he went on the run, and the police had to try to lure the perpetrator out with a trick. They also used April for this. When questioned, Joshua said that he was neither involved nor complicit in the massacre of Kim and that the others involved, who were his friends, were the guilty ones. When he learned this, he decided to cooperate with the investigators and told everything. He repeated what he said in court. Thus, Joshua was found guilty on several counts, except for murder. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Nicholas received the same sentence and went to prison for 58 years. Julio, who was only found guilty of aiding and abetting murder, received a prison sentence of between 2 106 years. On his daughter's regular birthday, which took place after the conclusion of the trial, her father Thomas came to the grave to rejoice with Kimberly that he had finally been able to punish the guilty. Kim's father fought against the bitterness of loss until the end, but he died of cancer in 2005. Many were still convinced that the brutal crime had undermined the health of a loving father. Nicholas was mistreated and attacked in prison. 2 years after the start of his imprisonment, he died of AIDS. Julio served his sentence and was released 2 years later. Joshua can only be released in the year 2053. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves. Even if money doesn't solve everything, it at least helps with many problems. But it certainly doesn't make bad people good. The protagonist of today's story was a rich man, but a very bad one, which unfortunately only worked to his advantage. The small town of Brentwood was about a 20-minute drive from Nashville. This place is known for its natural beauty and ranks among the 20 wealthiest and most prestigious places in the United States, with a population of about 40,000. The town is considered one of the safest. Since its founding in 1969, only 8 murders have occurred there. In fact, this city is regarded as one of the safest places in the country. It boasts luxurious parks, numerous restaurants, and clubs for affluent guests. Additionally, many headquarters of large manufacturing companies, including international organizations, are located here. Despite this track record, even in such paradisiacal places, real nightmares can occur. The house of Rachel and Randolph Maidens was located in a guarded country club on a hill. The estate covered a total of 600 hectares and featured an award-winning private golf course known as the #1 Governor's Club. The club was one of the wealthiest and most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. The couple's villa was 5,000 square meters in size and cost a fortune. It seemed like a real fortress where one could start a family and run a business. Rachel Elizabeth Maidens was a 34-year-old orthodontist who had her private practice in the city's business district. She was a very beautiful woman, naturally blonde, and a devoted mother to her daughter Natalie. Rachel attended a Catholic private school in Nashville and then went to a college in South Birmingham, followed by a dental school in Florida. Throughout her education, Rachel received numerous awards. The successful beauty also showed achievements in tennis. Her accomplishments included a prestigious scholarship. The crowning achievement of her academic success was completing her specialist training at the Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Despite her young age, the woman had a brilliant career. Thanks to her successes, she managed to open her own practice. She began publishing articles in professional journals and regularly gave lectures at conferences. However, not everything in her life was so successful. While still studying, on December 3, 2003, her father Richard was arrested for selling oxycodone. The man was a respected pharmacist but was involved in the trade of prescription drugs. Although law enforcement had just begun investigating his case, he was so afraid of losing his reputation that he took his own life just 2 days after his arrest. The family's nightmares didn't stop there, as the police continued to investigate all family members. The bank accounts of Rachel, her mother, and her brother were seized. The investigations dragged on for several years. Rachel's mother was fined $15,000, marking the end of the dark phase in their lives. Many close friends and family members claimed that all this caused great harm to her emotional state. However, this didn't stop her from pursuing professional success. She endured all these difficulties steadfastly and continued to develop her own activities. The woman still wanted to be the best in her profession, striving for wealth and independence. She managed to overcome the family's financial crisis and the terrible loss of a loved one, subsequently rehabilitating herself. Rachel took her life back into her own hands. Her husband Randy, as he was known in his close circle, grew up in Georgia. After high school, he attended the Georgia Tech College of Technology. Gradually, he became a well-paid pharmaceutical sales manager. But by the time of the tragic events, all of this had collapsed, and Randy was unemployed. Only 3 months before the described events, a noticeable change in his behavior had occurred, causing many problems. Rachel reported that he quickly descended into uncontrolled alcoholism. There was also suspicion that he was simultaneously consuming various medications, which exacerbated the harmful effects. During this time, several witnesses observed him entering a restaurant heavily intoxicated and harassing customers and staff. One of the employees felt compelled to call the emergency number 911. The young woman who made the emergency call identified the man as Randy Maidens, as he had dined here several times with his wife. A few minutes after the first call, she called emergency services again because she was even more worried. She said that some suspicious items had accidentally fallen out of the man's bag, including a shotgun and a suspiciously large bottle that looked like the painkiller Tylenol. The boorish guest gathered everything and then tried to leave the establishment. The waitress managed to persuade him to stay. The patrol officers who arrived at the scene immediately noticed that the man was behaving inappropriately, but couldn't say for sure whether he was drunk or under the influence of something stronger. Randy became anxious. He wanted to leave under the pretext that his wife had called him and asked him to come home. The waitress offered to contact his wife, but he refused to provide her phone number. The man tried to get into his vehicle, but the police officers didn't allow it. During the search of his car, another shotgun was found on the back seat. Despite these oddities, the man was not arrested. Several witnesses saw him being picked up by someone in a car that evening, someone who would never allow him to drive while intoxicated. When Randy was in such situations, he always asked that no one call his wife. The man complained that he was often the victim of her anger and was afraid of upsetting her. Considering his inappropriate behavior, this reaction seemed quite natural. On the evening of April 21, 2013, Rachel's mother Betty called the Brentwood Police Department and asked the officers to check her daughter's property. The woman immediately said that Randy was on the verge of taking his own life. She was worried because she couldn't speak with Rachel. Betty had tried calling her daughter for a long time, but the phone was answered by her husband, who refused to hand the phone to his wife. Finally, the woman lost her composure and threatened to call the police, which didn't work, so she had to keep her promise. The officers arrived at the house within minutes and immediately noticed that the curtains were drawn throughout the house. Since no one responded to knocking on the door, there was no way to see what was happening inside. Fortunately, the garage door was open. The police officers could enter the house and called out the residents by name. Neither Randy nor Rachel were in the house. Suddenly, a child responded to their calls. A 2-year-old girl named Natalie was on the first floor and was crying. The child refused to say what had happened and kept repeating the same sentence through tears. "Daddy is gone. Daddy is gone." During the inspection on the first floor, one of the officers stepped into the large hallway. Leaning over the balcony railing, he saw a blood-splattered wall and a shotgun lying on a couch on the ground floor. Rachel was found in the corridor between the living room and the hallway leading to the master bedroom. She showed no signs of life. She had been shot like at a shooting gallery, 8 shots from a 9mm pistol and 2 shotgun shells in the back. The victim was wrapped in a blanket. The investigation made it clear that someone had tried to wipe the blood from the walls, and visible stains were left on the floor. Naturally, the husband of the murdered victim, Randy Maidens, was immediately put on the wanted list. Helicopters and SWAT teams were deployed to prevent the suspect from escaping. The upscale residential area looked like a Hollywood blockbuster. The police officers actively worked with the victim's neighbors, trying to find out where the man might have gone. When the victim's mother heard the shocking news, she immediately came to pick up her grandchild. Her son-in-law was considered particularly dangerous due to his inappropriate behavior lately. It was expected that he would remain armed, which is why a warning was issued. Neighbors of the family confirmed that they had seen the fugitive on numerous occasions in an inappropriate state. On the kitchen table in the deceased's villa, a note was found. In it, Randy apologized profusely to his daughter and confessed that he loved her very much. He wrote that he was forced to flee because of his terrible deed, but didn't say what he had done. The man thanked all his wife's relatives for the years they had given him. Randy confessed that he could no longer endure the humiliations he experienced daily from his wife. He wrote that since the beginning of their relationship, she had morally executed him every night and treated him like dirt. After 7 years, he simply lost patience. On that fateful evening, his wife had started to harass him in the same way, and that was the last straw. The loving father wanted to take care of his daughter Natalie and apologized several times to the child because he couldn't take it anymore and gave up. He also emphasized that he didn't want the girl to stay with her mother and asked that custody be transferred to his wife's relatives on Rachel's side of the family. When the experts familiarized themselves with the content of the letter, the main suspect was still on the run. According to some experts, his letter could be interpreted not only as a confession, but also as a farewell note. This made the search efforts even more complicated and indicated that the man might already be deceased. Strangely, a car belonging to the man was parked in the driveway of the property. Inside, they found $7,000 in cash in a large bag in the trunk. Another approximately $3,000 in cash was found in the house. By checking phone records, the officers could determine that Randy had called his lawyer on the evening of the murder. Apparently, the man's original plan was to kill his wife and then take off with the money to start a new life. But then something went wrong, and he wrote the letter. Perhaps it was just staged to cover his tracks. But then why didn't he take his car? What could have prevented him? Especially since he still had enough time. Law enforcement suspected that it might have had something to do with Betty's calls. The woman called the police, which could have thwarted the criminal's plans. To the police's surprise, the search was of short duration. 12 hours after the search for the murderer began, Randy simply came out of the woods behind his house with his hands up. The man surrendered to the authorities without offering resistance. He immediately accused his wife of psychologically harassing him for years. The pressure had become particularly intense when he lost his job. Because of this behavior of his beloved wife, he had practically slipped into a life on the edge of society. In his defense, Randy said that he was Rachel's third husband, as the others couldn't endure her constant nagging either. However, this in no way justified 10 cowardly shots into his wife's back. The criminal had hardly had time to process the consequences of his prank at the restaurant 3 months earlier, and now there was also a charge of murdering his wife. It has become known that he had recently come into conflict with the law several times for minor offenses. Specifically, he was stopped in his car a few months before his wife's death when he was drunk. Due to the strong smell of alcohol, the police officer was sure that Randy was drunk, but the man refused to take a test. By law, this was equivalent to drunk driving. Later, he was involved in an accident with his car for exactly the same reason. He was so drunk that he crashed into a power station and darkened almost 200 houses for several hours. A few weeks before Rachel's murder, a neighbor saw a stranger with a ski mask and 2 dogs running through the woods. It was the same place from which Randy later emerged when he surrendered to the authorities. A neighbor spoke to the stranger and recognized Randy. She approached him to find out what was going on and immediately realized that the man was heavily intoxicated or under the influence of some substance. The neighbor said he had been walking his dogs and got lost, so he walked toward her property. According to the woman, at that time he had something like a bow and arrows in his backpack, so she hurried to get away. Later, he was seen many more times engaging in similar activities, which unsettled the residents of the houses near the maiden's residence. They feared for their safety. At the end of March, proceedings for trespassing were initiated against Randy in Florida, but he got away unscathed. The investigations were simply covered up. He was probably saved by money. The most disturbing incident occurred in January 2013 during a work conference in Orlando that he attended with his wife. One evening, he visited a bar and got so drunk that he was no longer able to speak coherently. The establishment staff asked him to leave the premises, but the man began smashing dishes and cursing. Several people heard him simultaneously threaten to kill his wife, but no one took these drunken threats seriously. Several guests tried to intervene to escort the rioting guest out of the bar, but Randy started fighting, so the police had to be called again. He was eventually arrested for disorderly conduct and consuming alcohol in public, but he was released the next day. His employer learned of the incident. The pharmaceutical company was concerned about its reputation, and Randy's inappropriate behavior was taken very seriously. One of his colleagues, who wished to remain anonymous, advised the man to take a temporary leave for health reasons. However, he didn't listen and returned to his workplace 3 days later. Consequently, he was fired. During the investigations, the police conducted numerous interviews with the murderer's colleagues, all of which were under strict confidentiality. The organization's management threatened to dismiss anyone who openly discussed the incidents with their alcoholic employee. According to these individuals, the perpetrator's behavior had drastically changed in the months before the incident with his wife. At the same time, he himself didn't explain what might be related to this, but always complained about his wife and blamed her for everything. Although everyone around him couldn't believe that his wife could push him so hard, Rachel always seemed nice, calm, and reasonable. It was hard to believe. But even if the woman scolded him at home, that's no excuse for behaving unrestrainedly in public places and posing a danger to strangers. It turned out that Randy's ex-girlfriend, Larissa Farley, was trying to contact him at the time of the abuse. They had been together in high school, but their romance didn't work out, and fate separated their paths. Larissa got married, divorced, and now remembered Randy, determined to meet him again and give it another try in adulthood. She learned about Randy's marital problems and assumed that the whole thing would end in divorce. In fact, she was shocked by the recent events in Randy's life and thought she could help him get his life back on track. Larissa had known him for over a decade. They had been friends for a long time. The woman claimed that there was not a single episode in Randy's biography that could be considered a prerequisite for violent retaliation. She knew him as a mature and intelligent man who valued his family and loved his child. At the same time, she also knew the other side of him. According to her, he had lived for a long time with an alcoholic father who treated him poorly. As he got older, he had a very strained relationship with his mother, which was one of the reasons why he didn't want his daughter Natalie to be placed in the care of his own family members. Larissa suspected that his problems and difficult childhood might have broken him and that the man needed help. Employees of the company from which the murderer was dismissed claimed they knew about his problems with illegal substances. According to colleagues and even the management, he had admitted long before the incident to struggling with his addiction. Nevertheless, it was believed that he had overcome these problems and their consequences in the years before the attack. But then he relapsed. What was the real reason for this man's misconduct that led to the murder of his wife? Immediately after his arrest, the 42-year-old Randy was charged with first-degree murder. He also endangered the life of a child, which was the second charge. Additionally, the man was found guilty of tampering with evidence, as he had tried to dispose of bloodstains and the blanket in which the victim was wrapped. The investigators were sure that he intended to eliminate the evidence of the crime and then flee, presumably to Mexico, with the money he had prepared. The bail was initially set at $2.5 million. He sat behind bars and awaited his trial. At the end of June 2013, the man had still not pleaded guilty to all charges. His lawyer was one of Nashville's best defense attorneys, named David Rabin. He sought a reduction of the bail and the man's release under house arrest, as he believed that Randy was actually a victim of his wife's tyranny. The defense attorney insisted that despite the discovery of a large amount of cash in Randy's car, no documents, cards, or other evidence were found indicating that the perpetrator intended to leave the city. The defense argued that his client had had enough time to flee, but he didn't. The prosecution held a different opinion for a long time. There was even a witness who claimed to have heard about plans to flee to Mexico, but this statement later turned out to be false. The mother of the deceased filed a civil lawsuit against her son-in-law because she wanted to prevent him from accessing the financial accounts and assets that he and his wife had acquired together. She feared that Randy would once again evade justice by bribing everyone he could reach with the family's assets. The woman was sure that this was the only way the criminal had previously escaped punishment for his offenses. Rachel's mother hoped that he simply wouldn't be able to bear the court costs and that he would get what he deserved for the heinous act he had committed. Despite everything, time played into the prisoner's hands. The lawyer managed to significantly reduce his bail to $750,000. Randy immediately posted this amount. Since his mother-in-law's lawsuit was still pending, this meant that he would have to wait at least another year and a half for his hearing. The trial was scheduled for September 2014. Surprisingly, the judge even allowed Randy to continue living in the house where the murder of his wife had been committed. However, the man had numerous difficulties to contend with, as the bail conditions still applied, and he was not allowed to leave the house without notifying the Brentwood police at least 24 hours in advance. During this time, he always had to have a lawyer with him and wear a GPS monitoring device in the form of an ankle bracelet. Contact with his daughter and the family members of his murdered wife was prohibited. In the meantime, the mother-in-law continued to fight and awaited a judgment in the civil case. She eventually succeeded in obtaining a restraining order on the couple's property from the court. Nevertheless, Randy simply entered the house and took his belongings and clothes. This came to light, so the man faced a new charge of contempt of court. Thanks to the efforts of his lawyer, however, this charge was dismissed. Such brazenness seemed unthinkable, but it later turned out that the criminal got away with a lot of money thanks to his connections to the governor's club and the city's law enforcement agencies. Investigations revealed that Randy hadn't simply fled into the woods after the murder. Several neighbors said they had discovered on the morning after the massacre that someone had tried to break into their house through garage doors and regular doors. The police officers checked the club's video recordings and found that it was Randy who had tried to break into the neighbor's house. With what exact intentions the man attempted this remains unclear, as he posed a significant danger. He himself denied these facts, and gradually everything was covered up. The judge's decisions, which allowed a dangerous criminal who had lost control of himself to remain at large for a year and a half, were long criticized and rightly questioned. Randy was a true example of how fatal impunity is. He was able to remain at large during the entire period, which he owed to a good lawyer who gave him the opportunity to await his trial. Only months later, in December 2013, he was caught trying to break into a residential complex in another suburb of Nashville called Bellevue. It was a rather bizarre incident reported by one of the residents of the apartment building. According to him, Randy tried to gain access by banging on the door and pretending to be a police officer. The man sensed that something was wrong when he didn't open the door to the uninvited guest, but he heard him doing the same at other apartments, so he called the police. When the police arrived, they found Randy once again heavily intoxicated. The very next day, the judge decided to revoke his bail. Amazingly, the manic alcohol excesses continued both before and after the murder of his wife. One can hardly imagine the fear his neighbors had lived in over the past year, especially when they learned that Randy had been released on bail and was living in the family villa next to them. It seemed that the murderer would soon get what he deserved, as under Tennessee law, his offense carried the death penalty. But his experienced defense attorney had an excellent plan. Unexpectedly, for the victim's family, Randy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and child neglect on September 29, 2014. As a result, he received only 25 years in prison. Strangely, this is not even half the maximum sentence for this catalog of offenses. The perpetrator could have received 60 years in prison. Furthermore, the murderer's lawyer managed to secure the right to parole, which will be possible under the condition of good behavior by the prisoner. Since he was 42 years old at the time of his sentencing, Randy will have the opportunity to be released at about the age of 60. During the sentencing, Randy said the following words: "Rachel, I promised to love and honor you, and I have betrayed all of that. I will live with this pain forever. No prison is worse than the one I have imposed on myself. To all of Rachel's relatives and friends, I am sincerely sorry that I have caused you so much pain and so many bad moments. The mother of the murdered victim, Betty, regarded this court ruling as a personal insult. She turned several times to higher instances to obtain a review and tightening of the sentence, but all was in vain. Randy himself commented on his lenient sentence as an opportunity to save at least one of Natalie's parents' lives. Naturally, Rachel's family was shocked by such decisions during the investigation and trial. The mother and brother turned to the public through the media to express their discontent about the matter. They also emphasized their grief over the brutal and tragic death of a beautiful, successful woman and expressed their protest by pointing out the absurd decisions of a justice system that seemed to be on the perpetrator's side. Randy was never charged with contempt of court, tampering with evidence, and previous offenses like drunk driving. Randy's lawyer responded to the accusation by conveying his client's sincere regret and condolences to the victim's family. However, Betty heard only platitudes that neither exonerated the perpetrator nor comforted her, nor could bring Rachel back. Natalie was placed in Betty's custody. The child will inherit her parents' entire estate when she comes of age. The victim's mother is still convinced that the only reason for her son-in-law's lenient sentence is his connections and his money. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. Many people know that strangers can make life a living hell, but unfortunately, loved ones are also capable of this. Sometimes, cruelty and the desire to control everything lead to ruined destinies, even to deaths. John Edwards was born on July 12, 1950, in the small town of Broken Hill in Australia. As a child, he was abused by his alcoholic parents. At the age of 17, John stole his mother's car and ran away from home, leaving behind a short farewell letter. It was never possible to bring him back. He left almost all his belongings behind and no longer wanted to contact his family. He began working to earn his living, changing professions and fields several times until he became interested in an offer from the Australian Department of Defense. In June of the third year, he joined the famous Green Berets. John served in the Army until his 8th year, when he was finally transferred to the Army Reserve. His career had its ups and downs. He was involved in real missions and performed well. During his service, John had serious relationships with 5 women, resulting in 8 children. For privacy reasons, the names of most of these women are not mentioned. His first serious relationship was at the age of 18. In 1968, the couple married, and the marriage produced 2 children, a son and a daughter. The first wife described their life together as a normal marriage, but sometimes John was a bit arrogant. For example, he limited the amount of money she could spend and could become irritable on the spot. Despite these manipulative traits, his wife was satisfied with everything, at least until the 7th year of their marriage. Together with the children, they went on vacation to the United States of America. Sometime after, the wife noticed that John was constantly corresponding with another woman he had met in Boston. The wife decided to end the marriage as she could not forgive the infidelity. John stayed with his lover in the United States. He wanted to keep his children with him, but the ex-wife did not allow this and took them with her. In the 7th year, he married for the 2nd time, this time with a woman from Boston. But they soon separated again because the wife was not satisfied with the man's aggressive behavior. John returned as a loner to his homeland, as he never had success. Therefore, he decided to contact his former wife. He tried to obtain custody of his children, but all he could achieve were weekend visits. Life experience taught John nothing. He remained the aggressor, and it seemed that his trip to the States only worsened the ex-military man's behavior. Gradually, the son and daughter became afraid of their father. His temper and relationship with his ex-wife deteriorated. John's behavior got out of control. Gradually, His children lost the desire to meet with their father because he was violent. But John believed that everything was his former wife's fault. In his opinion, it was the first wife who had caused such a rift in the relationships with the children. Therefore, he became angry and constantly called her, making threats. The man blamed everyone but himself for his ongoing life problems. His behavior towards the children did not improve. The son and daughter were very afraid of John and tried to avoid contact with their biological father at every opportunity. However, he insisted on the meetings. In 1977, John had a new girlfriend. The couple quickly began living together, and after 2 years of this relationship, a daughter was born. In 1984, they married. A son was born, but again, everything was unfavorable. During this time, John's third wife was severely harassed. His cruelty and aggressiveness became increasingly apparent. Even before the birth of their first son, she was pregnant, but her husband beat her so badly that she lost the child. John's outbursts of anger became increasingly frightening. He hit the woman, threw objects at her, and even threatened to set the shared house on fire while she slept. At the end of the 7th year, the situation became so unbearable that the woman decided to leave the tyrant. But she was afraid to say this directly. She feared her husband would kill her. She gathered the children and took the belongings she had prepared in advance. The woman waited until he took a shower one day. She thought this was the perfect opportunity to save herself and the children. She climbed over the fence with the children and, with the help of neighbors, notified the police. The man was arrested. In the meantime, the woman and the children had fled to the city and believed themselves safe. In fact, this report to law enforcement was by no means the first. The police had been dealing with this family for a long time, but John skillfully manipulated the victim, allowing him to evade responsibility and continue to oppress all those close to him. All of John's children spoke of the cruelty, the aggressive outbursts, and the moral pressure their father exerted. They were practically ignored by social services. John already had 2 daughters and 2 sons from 2 different women, and with both, he engaged in custody battles. Despite numerous allegations of abuse by his ex-wives and the children's reluctance to see their father, he managed to obtain permission to have contact with them. The sons and daughters were obliged to spend 3 evenings a week with their father, even though they obviously resisted. Social services remained inactive. The women claimed they had received threats and feared for the children's lives. Close family members confirmed that the man behaved inappropriately and aggressively, but the justice system ignored all these circumstances again. In December, the first wife finally obtained a restraining order against John. The reason was that he had unlawfully taken his daughter from school and then held her against her will for several days. Something similar had happened to the son before, but the police believed that the biological father had done nothing wrong. He had only tried to build a relationship with the children in this way. Eventually, the first wife managed to completely sever communication with the inappropriate man. At this point, his first daughter was 11 years old, so she could decide for herself whether she wanted to maintain contact with her father. As expected, she broke off all contact with him and simply ignored all his attempts to reach her. After the restraining order was obtained, the family breathed a sigh of relief. The third ex-wife, however, continued to feel under pressure and had no way to protect herself from her ex-husband. In the meantime, John did not miss any opportunities to build his private life. The man began a relationship with a 21-year-old woman. In 1999, she gave birth to a son from this cruel manipulator. By this time, their relationship had long ended. It seemed she could thereby escape the problems of other women, but she was mistaken. He began to harass her and claimed he wanted to maintain a relationship with his child. After some time, the young woman again succumbed to the manipulator's influence and resumed close contact. John promised to make amends. Of course, these were all standard manipulation tricks. Meanwhile, he had become very cruel and aggressive again. So the next victim of the sadist quickly recognized her mistake. The new woman and the son moved in with John and then moved out again. Living with a tyrant led to great stress. She became very thin and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but she finally managed to pull herself together and eventually left with her child in her arms. The woman turned to the police in hopes of obtaining protection. With the support of foundations, she managed to get a house into which she moved with her child and hid from John. As with the previous women, this did not stop the tyrant. He found out where she lived, kept coming by, tried to break down the door, and threatened her. With difficulty, John tried several times to kidnap her son. Eventually, he forced the woman to grant him joint custody, so the boy regularly went to his father's house, where the two children of his third wife also appeared. When the children grew up, they decided first to break off the relationship with their father. In 1999, the tireless John married again. As a skilled manipulator, he knew how to charm women and surround them with care and love. At that time, none of them recognized the true nature of the cunning man. His new wife became pregnant. This time, John's behavior changed dramatically, but not for the better. He asked her to terminate the pregnancy, but the wife did not obey. This threw the man into a frenzy. He provoked another conflict, attacked the woman, pushed her down the stairs, and beat her for a long time with his hands and feet. Apparently, the perpetrator wanted to get rid of the child himself in this way. The woman claimed that with each blow, he tried to hit her stomach. Despite his efforts, she managed to defend herself, and the baby survived. After the birth, John's next wife ran away and stayed in women's shelters, so her husband could not reach her. Nevertheless, he managed to find her and organize meetings. Over the course of a year, he constantly threatened her, demanded she return, and announced he would kidnap the child. And so the next victim of the manipulator went to court to obtain a divorce and sole custody of the child. The proceedings were concluded in her favor in September 2002. Unfortunately, in 2008, this woman by John was diagnosed with an incurable disease. By September, she had already passed away. Thus, John was granted custody of his 8-year-old son. By this time, the man already had 6 children from 4 different women, each of whose lives he had ruined. But John Edwards was not ready to stop there. In October 2000, the 50-year-old John met the 19-year-old Olga from Russia on a dating website. He was very nice and courteous, she said, showered her with compliments, and told her how beautiful life was in his homeland. So their romance began. At his invitation, Olga followed to Australia and decided to get to know John. In August 2001, she immediately moved in with him, and on November 10th, they married. Their son Jack was born in September 2002 and daughter Jennifer in August 2004. The children Jack and Jennifer lived with their parents in their house in the suburb of Pennant Hills in Sydney. It was a quiet, cozy area with much natural beauty and a close-knit local community. In the relationship with his young wife, there was nothing new. John was just as abusive towards Olga as he had been towards his previous wives and tried to control her every move. Unlike the other victims, the Russian immigrant had no way to defend herself. She could not run anywhere or turn to anyone. The circumstances forced Olga to tolerate and smooth over every angle as best she could. At the slightest disobedience, John threatened to take the children away from her and deport her back to Russia. Of course, the woman was in a very vulnerable position and was afraid of losing her children, so she endured everything. The man took control of the financial area, including his wife's salary, controlled the money, and began to dictate what she should wear and how she should look. He liked to exert moral pressure on her and bring her to tears. The manipulator provoked situations in which the young woman was ready to apologize for everything in tears as long as the abuse stopped. Olga and John's son, Jack, was headstrong but kind and free-spirited, a lively boy who loved sports and computer games. Despite his firm outlook on life, he was friendly and got along with everyone around him. When choosing his friends, Jack was selective, but for his loved ones, he was ready for anything, which he repeatedly demonstrated in life. His sister Jennifer was more reserved and quieter than her older brother. The girl spent hours reading books, loved animals, and ice skating. As Jennifer grew up, she had a dog named Max and a rabbit as pets. She spent hours playing with her pets. Riding the wave of love for little creatures, Jennifer dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, which she repeatedly told her family and at school. When their son Jack was about 10 years old, John began to exert moral pressure on his son, following exactly the same principle as with all his wives. Since the boy did not obey and only reluctantly complied with his father, he applied various sadistic techniques to inflict severe pain without leaving traces. For example, he broke his fingers with heavy objects. These abuses lasted for years and went so far that the boy lived in constant fear. He repeatedly tried to call the police, but his mother stopped him each time because she was afraid of losing her children. The boy began sleeping with a bat in his room. Only when he hid it under his pillow did he feel safe and could sleep. All the while, his sister Jennifer also witnessed these incidents. In 2015, she began sleeping with a knife under her pillow. It is hard to imagine an environment where children needed weapons to feel safe. During the same period, a family trip to Paris took place, during which there was a physical altercation between Jack and his father. The teenager ran out of the hotel, but his father caught up with him on the street and began beating him, pushing him against a wall and choking him. The situation got out of control, so much so that bystanders had to intervene. Afterwards, Jack wanted to call the police again, but his mother begged him not to. Again, the boy obeyed his mother. The incidents continued, and each time the man's outbursts of anger became more severe. Finally, in December 2015, Olga said she wanted to file for divorce. She could no longer tolerate such behavior. John began to apologize and begged her to stay, promising to change his behavior. The young woman gave him another chance, but in reality, things only got worse. In January 2016, the worried Olga turned to the police because her son had disappeared. Jack was reported missing. Only a few hours later, the police found him. It turned out that the teenager had run away from home and did not want to return, trying to save himself by doing the same thing John had once done to escape his family. Despite the obvious danger, the schoolboy was brought back to his family. The situation escalated further until the young woman finally made her final decision in March 2016. On March 11th, she left the city with the children and went to a neighboring town where she stayed with acquaintances. She was now aware of the tendency towards stalking that her husband had vividly demonstrated with her and his ex-wives. Olga feared his appearance in her life and asked them not to reveal her whereabouts. Nevertheless, John appeared on the doorstep of the house where his wife and children were hiding from him. In April 2016, the process between Olga and John began. The woman and her children applied for a restraining order against the father to protect themselves. John did not remain idle either. In the hearing, he reported the dangers the children were allegedly exposed to while they were with their mother without him. During this time, he also sought out a psychiatrist. He was diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts. However, the psychotherapist concluded that the man was generally fine. In his conclusion, he pointed to post-traumatic stress disorder. John used the whole situation to prove that he was working on himself and trying to cope with the consequences of the problems he had suffered. He referred to his difficult childhood. Olga lived in another city. The refugees were forced to move several times, so the tyrant could not find them. Nevertheless, the court decided that the son's residential address had to be communicated to the father, but it was temporarily decided that John should not come closer than 500 meters to Olga and the children. In reality, this played little role, as he kept following them and trying to make contact. Once, he came to Jennifer's school and tried to give her a dog, and later he met Jack at the train station and wanted to give him an apology letter. At the same time, John hired a private detective to keep an eye on his family. Later, the man allegedly ran into Olga by chance when he came to the studio where she was doing yoga. The incident occurred in February 2017. According to a confession he later made to the police, John regularly came to the fitness studio and worked out there. The staff believed he only came to the gym to ogle the women. He behaved strangely and inappropriately, which drew attention. The police ignored Olga's claim that he had violated the restraining order and simply believed John that it was an accident. In contrast, she insisted that the whole thing was a clear case of harassment, but it was as if she were not being heard. By October 2017, John had expanded his collection with 2 revolvers and a semi-automatic pistol. Then he went to the police station and claimed that people were wrongfully accusing him. In this way, he wanted to improve his chances of getting custody of his children, but it didn't help him. In February 2018, the court decided that Olga would have sole custody of the children and that they would not have to have contact with their father unless they wanted to. Naturally, neither Jack nor Jennifer showed any desire to have contact with their father. Olga and the children finally breathed a sigh of relief. They thought they had managed to pull themselves together, but in reality, the battle had just begun. On June 25, 2018, John Edwards rented a large limousine until July 7th and kept an eye on Olga and the children. He consulted a computer expert and deleted all information on his hard drive and in his browser. On July 4th, he retrieved the pistols from his gun cabinet. Apparently, he was very agitated as he closed the door so tightly that it jammed. A specialist was later required to open the lock. July 5, 2018, was a completely normal day for Olga and her children. She took them to school and then drove to work herself. That day, John left his friend Peter a large envelope labeled, "In case something happens to me." Additionally, there was a note stating that he should not open the envelope before a certain time. The friend obeyed. After the tragedy, Peter found several smaller envelopes inside with a will and letters, as well as $533 in cash. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer got off the school bus and headed home. She was unaware that her father had followed her. Around 5 p.m., Jennifer's neighbor heard several loud bangs. He ran onto the porch and saw John coming out of the house. The neighbor tried to find out what had happened, but John simply got into his car without a word and drove away. The man knew about the problems the family had been struggling with for years. The neighbor opened the door and called out to the house's occupants, but no one answered. He notified the police. The police officers arrived at the house and went inside. They found 13-year-old Jennifer and 15-year-old Jack lifeless in the son's room under a computer desk. The children had been shot, probably trying to hide from the murderer. The police found Jack lying on Jennifer. It was the boy's last heroic act, trying to shield and save his little sister, which, however, he did not succeed in doing. Jack was shot 6 times in the back and chest. Most of the shots were fired from a distance. However, a contact wound was found on the boy's shoulder, indicating that the shot was fired with the muzzle pressed against his body. Jennifer suffered 16 gunshot wounds to the chest, abdomen, arms, and legs. At this point, Olga returned to the house, unaware of what had happened. Police cars were parked around the house, and a helicopter circled over the houses. She was told that her son and daughter were dead and that her ex-husband was being sought by the police. Olga immediately stated that the only person capable of such a thing was John Edwards. The police kept Olga's house under surveillance, believing she would be the man's 3rd victim who would return to her. However, he did not appear. Around 6 a.m. the next morning, the police arrived at the suspect's apartment. As it turned out, the 67-year-old John had returned home after the massacre of the children and shot himself in the head. His neighbor said that he went for a walk with his dog around 6 p.m. At that time, he heard a loud bang from the direction of Edward's house. Later, the man took the dog home because the animal was restless. When he returned to see what had happened, he saw a broken window and could no longer reach John. In the pocket of his clothing, a crumpled piece of paper was found with Jennifer's bus schedule, every day to and from school. In the garage, investigators found a toolbox with shredded documents, burnt pieces of paper, a destroyed tablet, and a mobile phone. 2 handguns were found in the house, which were used in the shootings of the children. The ballistic examination confirmed that these were the weapons used in the double murder. According to the investigations, the reason for the murder was the loss of custody. At this point, all of John's older children had already broken off contact with their father. All his previous wives had obtained restraining orders against him. John had lost control over his last wife, his son, and his daughter. This might have been the last chance for the manipulator. Having lost everything, he decided to kill his son and daughter. However, this was not a momentary impulse of madness. John carefully prepared for the act. First, he bought 3 rifles but quickly realized that they were too bulky to use inconspicuously for a murder. Then he bought pistols and revolvers. Next, he calculated the children's daily routines, school bus schedules, and Olga's work hours. He also entered numerous internet search terms. John deleted the information and destroyed everything he used. Obviously, he wanted to eliminate traces of the preparation for the crimes, down to the smallest details like the browser history. Some of the information was, however, recovered, but the bloody story was not yet over. Olga was devastated, emotionally shattered, and unable to cope with the loss of her children. Her mother realized that her daughter needed support and flew from Russia to her. Her mother gave her full support and tried to bring her back to life. But the woman could not stay in Australia for long. After 4 months, the mother had to return home. Olga refused to follow her mother and decided to stay in Australia. Despite her mother's pleas, Olga took her own life 5.5 months after the killing of her 2 children. During this time, she continued to live in the house where her ex-husband had shot her son and daughter and slept in her son's bed. Her body was found there by a neighbor. Close family members believe that Olga blamed herself for her children's death all along and took this desperate step. The heartbreaking story of Olga and her children became public knowledge. Residents asked legitimate questions. How could law enforcement allow this cruel tragedy despite numerous restraining orders? Why did the children, who were subjected to daily beatings and forced to sleep with weapons, have to go to such lengths to isolate themselves from their tyrannical father? And it didn't help them. The authorities completely ignored most of the allegations made by all of John's ex-wives, a man with obvious problems. How many women and children in this country must still suffer because law enforcement has failed to protect them from stalkers? The state police department conducted an internal investigation to find out which reasons played a decisive role and could have led to this terrible incident. All this happened under public pressure, fearing that they would try to cover up the incident. It was found that several law enforcement officers had acted negligently. They failed to record reports of harassment during yoga classes and attempts to have contact with children despite court orders. The man received no punishment for his systematic offenses. On the contrary, the ex-military seemed to find much more hearing than the victims of his tortures themselves. Even during the custody dispute, Olga encountered resistance. The lawyer, for example, did not consider John dangerous and completely ignored the existing restraining orders that all his ex-wives had applied for. After an investigation, proceedings were initiated regarding the behavior of the lawyer who was involved in the custody cases. For some reason, the defender ignored all the teenagers' claims that John had systematically morally abused them. The lawyer stated that he did not give weight to these statements because of their age. In reality, his behavior tied John's hands and helped the tyrant implement his criminal plans. The tragedy of Olga, Jack, and Jennifer has highlighted the vulnerability of the existing system in Australia and triggered a global reassessment of the care and social protection system. Efforts have begun to modernize the system, which could improve the response to domestic violence. Until now, the firearm registry was not linked to the list of offenders. This has become an urgent problem that should actually be solved, but the work is progressing slowly. So far, no global changes have been made in this direction. The relatives of the victims of this tragedy are striving for justice and the conviction of all those who acted negligently and made mistakes. Nevertheless, Olga's relatives have not achieved any success. John's ex-wives and Olga's parents are sure that the horrific massacre could have been prevented. Unfortunately, the system did not show the right interest in this situation. The negligence of social services and the police not only allowed John to take the lives of his two children, but also drove their mother to suicide. John Edwards will forever remain a tyrant who did not have the courage to leave this world without being held accountable for his actions. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.